I never intended to spend Christmas alone. It wasn't the plan, but after Mom passed away in October, I couldn't bring myself to join my family at Aunt Clara's house for the holiday. Mom loved Christmas. She was the one who brought the magic to it, decorating every corner of our little cottage, singing carols, and baking her famous sugar cookies. This year, I couldn't face the joy everyone else was pretending to feel. The cottage was quiet, blanketed in snow, and surrounded by dense woods. The isolation felt oddly comforting at first. I told myself I'd make the best of it, light a fire, drink some hot chocolate, and watch one of those old Christmas movies Mom used to love. But by nightfall, the silence started to feel oppressive. At 9 p.m., just as I was beginning to doze on the couch, there was a knock at the door. 3 raps, slow and deliberate. My heart jumped. Who could it be at this hour? The closest neighbors lived miles away, and the snowstorm outside made an unexpected visitor unlikely. I opened the door to find nothing. No one. Just the icy wind howling through the trees. For a moment, I stood there, straining my ears. That's when I heard it. Faint humming, just audible over the wind. Silent Night. It was so soft I almost thought I was imagining it. I shut the door and locked it, trying to shake the unease settling in my chest. It's just the wind, I told myself. Or maybe kids playing a prank. But the humming didn't stop. By 10 p.m., it was louder, more distinct. It wasn't coming from outside anymore. It was coming from the edge of the woods. I turned off the lights and peeked through the window. That's when I saw them. 3 figures stood at the tree line, just beyond the porch light. They were impossibly tall and thin, their outlines barely visible in the shadows. They wore long cloaks that swayed in the wind, and though I couldn't see their faces, I felt their eyes on me. Their mouths moved, singing that same haunting melody. Silent Night, Holy Night. My hands trembled as I backed away from the window. I locked every door, every window, drawing the curtains tight. My breathing was shallow, and my heart pounded in my ears. At 11 p.m., the knocking started again. Louder this time, more insistent. I didn't answer. Instead, I crouched in the corner of the living room, clutching Mom's old rosary. Then came the voice. Will you join us? For the song? It was low and raspy, like dry leaves scraping against a window pane. I screamed, unable to hold it in. The knocking stopped, but the singing didn't. It grew louder, closer, as though the figures were inside the house. I ran to my bedroom and locked the door, but the melody seeped through the walls. Footsteps echoed in the hallway, slow and deliberate. Sleep in heavenly peace. I hid under the bed, pressing the rosary to my chest, tears streaming down my face. The door creaked open, and the footsteps stopped beside the bed. The last thing I remember was the cold, a bone-deep chill that swept over me as the voice whispered, Silent Night. When I woke up, I was outside, standing in the snow. The cottage was gone, replaced by a forest I didn't recognize. My voice joined theirs, hollow and broken, as I sang the carol. Now every Christmas Eve, we find someone new to join us. I was 9 when I found out Santa wasn't real. I wish it had been some heartwarming coming-of-age revelation, but the truth was far less magical. My parents didn't even try to keep up the illusion that year. They were too busy fighting, shouting matches that rattled the walls and filled our tiny house with tension. Christmas was an afterthought. The tree never came out of the attic, and the dusty box of ornaments stayed untouched in the corner. Mom barely cooked, and Dad spent most of his time at the bar down the street. The house smelled of stale air, a faint whiff of beer, and Mom's burnt toast. It didn't feel like Christmas at all. Maybe that's why I begged Mom to let me pick out a new stocking. The old ones, tattered and worn, didn't feel special anymore. Somehow, a new stocking would make things right again. Mom sighed and waved me off with a sure, go pick one. She barely looked up from her crossword puzzle. At the store, my eyes were drawn to a red stocking with soft white trim. It was plain compared to the flashy, glitter-covered ones with cartoon Santas and reindeer, but something about it felt warm and comforting. It reminded me of the stockings I'd seen in old Christmas movies, the kind that hung over roaring fireplaces in happy homes. I chose it, hoping it might bring a little magic back into our house. That night, I hung it by the fireplace. We didn't have a fire, of course. Our chimney hadn't worked in years, but the empty hearth was the only place it felt right. I imagined it stuffed with candy, tiny toys, and maybe even a note from Santa, even though I knew better now. The first sign that something was wrong came just after midnight. I was lying in bed, trying to drown out the muffled sounds of my parents arguing downstairs, when I heard a faint rustling. At first, I thought it was the wind rattling the windows. Our house wasn't well insulated, and the winter wind had a way of finding its way inside. But this wasn't the wind. It was coming from the living room. A soft, irregular sound, like something shifting and scraping against fabric. My first thought was that the cat had climbed onto the mantel again, but then I remembered. We didn't have a cat. I crept out of bed, careful to avoid the creaky spots on the floor. The house was dark, the only light coming from the moon through the frosted windows. The rustling grew louder as I approached the living room, a wet, sticky sound joining it now. My heart began to pound. When I peeked around the corner, I froze. The stocking was moving. It swayed gently, as though something inside it was shifting, struggling. The white trim rippled as the red fabric stretched unnaturally, its shape warping and bulging. "Mom," I whispered, my voice barely audible. The stocking stopped. I stood there, holding my breath, waiting for some rational explanation to present itself. Maybe I was dreaming. Maybe it was a mouse. But then the stocking began to stretch again, wider this time. The top opened impossibly large, like a mouth unhinging. It wasn't just fabric anymore. It was flesh. The red turned darker, wetter, and the white trim glistened as though coated in saliva. A long, clawed hand emerged first, its fingers curling against the mantel like it was testing its strength. The claws were jagged, yellowed, and chipped, but they moved with precision, scraping softly against the wood. The hand was followed by an arm, long and thin, with skin that looked like it had been pulled too tightly over brittle bones. Then came the head. I'll never forget the head. It had no eyes, just deep, hollow sockets that seemed to drink in the darkness. Its mouth stretched from ear to ear, or where ears should have been, filled with sharp, uneven teeth that clicked together as it moved. It grinned at me, a grotesque parody of holiday cheer. "Merry Christmas," it rasped, its voice dry and crackling, like leaves crushed underfoot. I stumbled backward, my legs barely obeying as I turned to run. The creature crawled after me, its body slithering out of the stocking like an endless coil. Its limbs were impossibly long, bending at unnatural angles as it moved, scraping and clicking against the floor. "Don't run," it hissed almost playfully. "You're on the nice list." I bolted up the stairs, the creature's laughter echoing behind me. When I reached my room, I slammed the door shut and pressed my back against it, my hands fumbling for the lock. My heart raced as I listened, waiting for the sound of claws against wood. But it didn't come. Instead, there was silence. For a moment, I thought it was over. Maybe I'd imagined it all. Maybe the stress of the holidays and my parents fighting had finally broken me. Then I turned around. The stocking was hanging on the back of my door. I screamed, but the sound died in my throat as the stocking began to open again, wider and wider, revealing rows of jagged teeth. I threw myself out the window, landing in the snow below. My ankle twisted painfully, but I didn't care. I ran, barefoot and sobbing, until I reached the neighbor's house. The police didn't believe me. They chalked it up to a bad dream, exacerbated by the unstable environment at home. My parents didn't seem to notice that the stocking was gone, but I know what I saw. I never went back to that house, not even to collect my things. And every Christmas since, I've noticed something strange. No matter where I am, no matter how far I run, the red stocking always finds me. And every year, it gets hungrier. Every Christmas Eve, my parents would gather the family around the piano, and my younger sister, Clara, would sing. She had the sweetest voice, always the center of attention. But something changed the year she became obsessed with the song. The Last Carol, they called it. A forgotten Christmas tune from the 1800s, passed down by distant relatives who claimed it held a dark, unbreakable curse. No one remembered the full lyrics, only fragments. And Clara wanted to piece it back together. That Christmas Eve, after dinner, while the fire crackled, Clara insisted on playing the piano. She'd been practicing the song obsessively for weeks, her fingers dancing over the keys with unnerving precision. "I'll find the missing verse," she promised, her voice determined, a gleam of something darker behind her eyes. At first, it sounded beautiful, ethereal even. The notes filled the room, weaving a melody that was both haunting and captivating. But soon, I began to notice something strange. The air grew cold. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch unnaturally long. My parents exchanged uneasy glances. The song reached its peak, a high, almost sorrowful note, and then Clara began to sing the lost words. That's when everything changed. Her voice didn't sound right anymore. It was distant, cold, robotic even. And then we realized it wasn't just her voice. It was something else. The room became heavier. The flickering candle flames turned into small, flickering eyes. Shadows moved in places they shouldn't have. "I found it," Clara whispered, her fingers still moving. "I found the last verse." Her face was pale, drained of color, yet there was a sinister smile on her lips, a knowing grin. "That wasn't a song," my mom finally choked out, her voice trembling. "That wasn't the carol we know." But Clara didn't stop. The music grew louder, more desperate. Her voice turned more guttural, inhuman even. And the worst part, it seemed as though the song wasn't just echoing through the room. It was coming from within us, from our very minds. I watched my parents fall into a trance-like state. Their bodies slumped forward, their breath shallow. I could hear them whispering fragments of the song under their breath, phrases too unsettling to comprehend. "Stop," I yelled, grabbing Clara's wrist. But her eyes glowed with something dark, something that wasn't human. "You don't understand," she hissed. "It's too late." The final verse, a terrifying, broken chant, resounded through the room. And in that moment, I felt it. A heavy weight press against my chest, pulling me into a void of endless cold. When I woke, the house was silent. The fire had gone out. The candles had melted into puddles of wax. My parents were gone. Clara sat motionless at the piano, her fingers still pressed against the keys, unmoving. Her eyes were wide open, yet hollow. Empty sockets stared back at me. I screamed. The next days were a blur. I called the police, but they found nothing. My parents' beds remained untouched, their possessions still in place. Only Clara. She sat at the piano, staring blankly, lost in her own world. They told me to put her in a mental facility. They said it was grief overwhelming her. But I knew better. The curse wasn't done. I fled the house, leaving behind everything. The memories, the history, the dark melody that consumed us. But even now, when the wind howls through the trees, I hear her voice again. That haunting song, the last verse. And it knows I won't escape it forever.